This tragic event was also an opportunity for the State College Police Department to make changes within their own department.
So since March of 2019, the community and the police department have made significant strides toward bettering the community through recognition and diversity initiatives. There have been various programs like the 320 Coalition and others who have continued to press for change, community members who have chosen diverse elected and appointed officials, the Borough Council who voted to have a community oversight board, and the State College Police Department who just recently hired a new social worker to help with the mental health calls. Tonight we are gathered here to have a constructive conversation about opposing views. We understand that no group is a monolith and no one person's ideals or thoughts speaks for an entire community. This is not a debate. This is not set up in a way to attack any particular group or any group ideology. The questions being posed to the panel tonight were compiled from the questions submitted by the community, local organizations, and law enforcement. They will be asked to all panelists, and each panelist will have a chance to respond to each question. At the end, if time permits, we will ask questions from the submissions made up front when you came in and allow for participants from the audience to ask relevant questions. Any questions that are not answered tonight are likely to be answered in future events.
We are fortunate enough to be graced with local experts, those folks sitting up on stage, who can speak about the intersectionalities of policing and race. Without further ado, in alphabetical order, let's introduce each panelist. Anton Aliquin is a raise your hand, Anton. There he is a Structural Reform Committee chair of the 320 Coalition. He is passionate about addressing how racism affects all communities of color and uniting people to make change in their communities. He is a fourth-year underground student studying immunology and infectious disease. Sounds very important right about now. Round of applause for Anton, please. Round of applause. Next, in 2020, Patricia Best, raise your hand, Patricia, was appointed by the State College Borough Council and the Center County Commissioners to chair the task force on mental health crisis services. Dr. Best facilitated the 32-member volunteer community task force, culminating in 21 recommendations to enhance the current system of crisis services for those in need and for their families. She also chaired the Progress Review Committee, appointed to review the initial implementation of the recommendations. A round of applause for Patricia. Dr. Patricia. Lieutenant Chad Hamilton, right there, accepted a position with the State College Police Department in 2006 and currently serves as the Criminal Investigations Supervisor. Lieutenant Hamilton is the department's Crisis Intervention Team Coordinator. He serves as the Center County CIT Steering Committee and is a member of the Center County's Crisis Negotiations Team and is a verbal de-escalation instructor. A person with a lot of syllables in his business card. Please give a round of applause for Lieutenant Chad Hamilton.
All right. Trying to get pictures up, sorry. All right, next I'd like to introduce Iris Richardson. Iris, give us a wave, thank you. Iris was appointed Penn State University's first Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Police and Public Safety Department. Her duties include providing overall direction and guidance, planning, policy input, strategic communication, and technical and internal support for university police and public safety around diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Give her a round of applause. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shobha Sivaprasad Wadia. And Dr. Wadia is an Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Did you give a wave? Thank you. Yeah. The Samuel Weiss Faculty Scholar and Clinical Professor of Law at Penn State Law in University Park. Her research focuses on the role of prosecutorial Discretion in Immigration Law and Intersections of Race, National Security, and Immigration. Her work has been published in numerous law journals, and she is the author of 2 award-winning books. Thanks for being with us. All right. Terry Watson. Terry? I'll try. There's.
No, almost.
There's
almost.
Shoba.
We're getting there. No.
No.
There it is. There it is. Yeah.
All right. Terry Watson is a professional speaker, author, and trainer who specializes in the topics of disability, equity in education, racial justice, and law enforcement. Mr. Watson has more than 15 years of working in higher education and more than 25 years of providing workshops on topics of bias and discrimination, addressing generational trauma, and confronting racism. Mr. Watson is the founder of Strategies for Justice, a platform for people of color in law enforcement to engage their communities and build trust through their narratives. Thank you. Yeah. And Officer Dean Woodring. Dean, there you are. Officer Woodring served in the United States Army Reserve from 2007 until 2016 as an enlisted member in the Military Police Corps and as a commissioned officer in the Adjunct General Corps. He graduated from Penn State in 2012 with a BS in Criminal Justice, and he currently serves our community as a Community Relations Officer. So thank you.
So we're about to hop into the questions, but before we do, can you pull up the rules one more time, Sue?
I will go back there.
Real quick, I'm going to ask everyone, take a quick look at these rules, all right? I'm going to ask if they're okay with you, and on the count of 3, I'm going to assume everyone's going to say yes. So say yeah on the count of 3, okay? Take a look at them. These are the rules. So, do you agree with these rules? 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Awesome. Wow. It sounded great.
It was.
Great way to start. Everyone, the way that we're going to do this is that we have 7 different topics and 7 different questions. 1 question per topic. We have about 14 minutes per question. Each person on stage gets about 2 minutes to give an answer to said question. If there are moments in which there are not responses from all participants, we will allow further discussion to happen on stage. So if we cut you off, it's not because we're being mean, it's because there's a time limit. So with that, the first topic relates to specific actions/programming and discussion about the unique needs of the State College community. That's the premise. That's the topic. The question: what does a successful model of policing look like in Centre County? How, and the second part is, how can trust be built between law enforcement and the community? Now I'll point to one of y'all if y'all don't want to hop onto it.
There she goes.
Should be good.
Hello?
There you go.
There we go. Yes. Okay. Hello? Yes. Okay. Got it.
Oh, go ahead.
I just see. Hello? No, come on. I don't like this. Yeah. And then I get nervous. You put too many mics next to each other and you get the sound. Good evening, everyone. I just want to start by saying that a successful model for policing is going to look very different in Centre County, and the point that we all wanted to point out is because we have 6 different police departments in this town, and so every last one of them have different communities that they serve. There's some overlap that's there, but for me, ideally, is understanding the community that you serve and the needs and what they look for is, I think, is going to be successful. For an individual like myself who works at the university, is going to look different because my clientele changes every 6 months. For those that are in State College, Borough, or Ferguson, you're here because you're lifelong I can't talk today, community members. And so it's going to look different what success looks like for me than it is for my colleagues that I share this space with, is all I want to say.
Awesome, thank you. Feel free to hop on in, y'all. And then if y'all don't talk, we'll point to one of you to kind of respond.
All right, so.
You're good.
Am I on? Okay. Yeah. From the policing perspective, kind of building on what was just said, I just wanted to say first and foremost that Center County is very fortunate to have the departments that it has, especially to be fortunate to have two departments within it that have full-time community relations positions, or offices rather. State College being one and Penn State being the other, and we work very closely together because the borough encompasses quite a bit of the campus itself. But again, building on what was just said, I think it's important that we continue to use the resources that we have. State College PD continuously participates in outreach events, but I think it's important that to make this even more successful is reaching out to those community members that may be hesitant to participate in said events and gain a better understanding of each other so that we're more comfortable participating in those events with each other and building that trust. So I don't go over 2 minutes, I'm going to kind of stop there.
I can go while you're figuring out the technology. First of all, hello everyone. I'm Anton. Again, like Jason and Sue both mentioned, I am the Structural Reform Chair for the 320 Coalition. So as an advocacy group in the community, that is one of the questions that we have been trying to ask ourselves for the longest time while we've been doing this work, is how would policing look like in Center County to make it more equitable, to make it so that communities of color feel safe, to make it more equitable, to make it so that communities of color feel safer. As a part of the 320 Coalition, I can say that I'm a police abolitionist, and so I think to define that in my own perspective is to take the system of policing and remove the racialized structure that has been that in which it was founded. And so what that looks like is sort of up in the air, right? And I think that's similar for a lot of people who also say that they are police abolitionists. And as someone who works in communities, I think something that has been shared among a lot of these communities is they see police as purely punitive rather than increasing the safety of the places that they live. And so I think that is one of the biggest things that would be able to address some of these shortcomings in this model of policing that we have here, and to sort of suggest some specific actions. I'm a public health person, and so public health, I think, also parallels a lot of the things that policing may suffer from as well, in terms of they don't really, or they're not as recognized for their contributions into actually helping public health, and I'm assuming that is something that policing also feels. And so working on that communication is something that the public health community has been working to push forward as a way to exhibit the amount of contributions that they make to the community, and I think that could be a way to help policing as well.
You had an applause, someone applauded you there. So for me, one thing that I think, and this is a two-part question, and I want to sort of touch a little bit on the trust part of it.
If we can, real quick, as you begin to answer the questions, make sure you reintroduce yourself. Again, remind folks who you are, what you represent.
So let me reintroduce myself. I'm Terry Watson, the founder of SFJ, which is a speaking platform that works with law enforcement and communities of color. And I think anytime we talk about trust, it always starts with a level of transparency for me. I think the other part to that too is when you have departments and law enforcement and they're trying to build trust, that they have to be able to get buy-in from the internal politics first. So like you really can't have a department try to build trust, and you have folks who are against it inside the department. And I think part of the transparency comes from identifying who those individuals are. And at the very same time, if you have officers who are trying to be community-oriented, making sure they have a space and a platform to do that. I've seen plenty of times where there's been law enforcement who try to engage their communities, but were not supported by the department in doing so. And that really also said that you see a lot of turnover because of that too, so, yeah.
As a reminder, as we all talk, if you see green light, don't have to press any buttons. Okay.
Just hold it.
Yeah, there you go.
Simple enough. Thank you. Patricia Best, and my role here was in my function as facilitator of the Mental Health Crisis Task Force, and so that'll be, as you listen to my comments this evening, that'll be the lens through which I share information with you as well. As Susan and Jason mentioned in their introductions, the Task Force on Mental Health Crisis Services was appointed by the Borough Council and the Center County Commissioners. The charge to the committee was to recommend enhancements to and identify strengths in the mental health crisis delivery system in Center County. Law enforcement was one of 4 main areas of that study. And I would encourage you to go onto the borough's website. You can read, I hesitate to say this, all 72 pages of the study. They're really interesting. So that's on the borough website. The task force consisted of 32 members of the community. We were a diverse group representing state and local mental health services, law enforcement, education and social services, the faith community, local advocacy groups, and community members who had experienced the system. So our charge was not to provide a successful model of policing per se, but to address one specific aspect of a model. So for the purpose of our overall conversation this evening, I'll focus on several of those areas that directly concern the role of law enforcement and resulted in several key recommendations among the 21 of that task force. Starting with the end in mind, after 18 months of very concentrated work, 6 foundational themes emerged related to our community and our services. I'm going to share those with you because while they apply to the mental health crisis continuum as a whole, they also apply to effective policing as part of that continuum, and I think they'll resonate with you as we go through our discussion this evening. These themes are, first and second, to enhance delivery of care to individuals and cultural responsiveness for every individual experiencing a mental health crisis across the system. Those were the first 2. These were all considered important. This wasn't in a hierarchical order. Third, to enhance communication with families within departments, between providers at different steps across cultures and subpopulations. Fourth, to enhance coordination of services to increase efficiency and effectiveness of delivery. Fifth, to enhance collaboration across all areas to improve provision of services, accessibility, and use of resources. And finally, sixth, consistency in practices so that we might provide better information to the public, consistencies in language, in definitions, in training where applicable, and regulations to help that understanding. Bringing about, this is the connection I want to make to this question, bringing about changes that address directly these 6 themes enhances service and positive outcomes, not only for those needing the services, but for those responsible for performing them. And to the second part that Terry directed us as well, delivering on these 6 themes through action contributes mightily to building trust between law enforcement and the community. One more sentence. I know they ceded their time to me, didn't you? Right. One more sentence, or 2. In our conversation this evening, I'm looking forward to sharing with you specific, very positive actions around these themes that have been initiated to bring about enhancements in that mental health crisis system that pertain to law enforcement as a result of the recommendations of that task force. So, spoiler alert, you're going to hear co-responder model, education and training, behavioral health diversionary program, behavioral health court, and more later.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
I didn't
you.
know everyone was writing an essay prior to coming here this evening, but thank you for that.
That's a former teacher for you.
One thing I do want to highlight before we continue that is super important. The common themes, if you can track them throughout these conversations, is going to be really important to kind of bring the full picture together. There are going to be a couple words that are going to be said a lot, and some of them were just mentioned.
Shobha Sivaprasad Wadia. Nice to see you all, and I'll cede some of my time to Patricia. So the lens that I'm going to answer this question in is as the director of the Center for Immigrants' Rights Clinic at Penn State Law, which some of you might be familiar with. And I'm going to really focus on the second question too, and that is, how do you build trust? And I first looked at the question and thought that, first, the starting place has to be that that's even a value in the first place between police and communities. And also in the bucket is having guiding values and principles to inform a relationship. So I think that's pretty important to building trust, whether it's in the immigration space that I'm often swimming in, or in any other one. The second, and again, seemingly simple, is just building relationships. And that can be professionally, from one institution to another, but also on a personal level, right? Because we know that often, the warmth or the trust that comes during relationships might be through an ordinary conversation or a meeting of the minds of shared values in other spaces. And then finally, and this really dovetails with something Patricia said, and that is having some type of common vision or policy going forward. So at the Center for Immigrants' Rights, much of these components of relationship building, of education, of shared values have really been what has informed our relationship with the Borough State College broadly and the State College Police Department specifically for the last several years.
Thank you. I'm Chad Hamilton. I'm obviously looking at this as a police officer. And the first question, the successful model, is what we come up with. I've been fortunate this is my landing zone for retirement, the State College Police. I've worked in other communities. These conversations are not had with a lot of police departments in the Commonwealth or across the country. And I think just starting off, having these conversations, bringing everybody together and doing things like this is a great way to come up with a model. What that model looks like might be different this year versus what it's going to look like next year. And I'll keep mine short. The trust factor is, how do we build trust? That's incident by incident, person by person. Every officer has a responsibility to do that every day with everybody they talk to. It's listening and understanding, no matter what form we're in, whether it's an officer handling a simple call, what might be a simple call, or what Dean and I are doing tonight. That's how it happens, is try to go back to the humanity of it all.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. First round done. We got through the first question. You have to swipe off the sweat. Reminders, keep the microphones a little bit closer to your face if you can. And everyone, encourage them with a smile every once in a while. It's fine. So let's move on to the second question.
Waiting for it to pop up. Well, go ahead. How does race and/or ethnicity affect one's interaction with law enforcement and the community? Look at that, they're grabbing.
Set, go. No. So, this is a really, first of all, can I just talk about one of my biggest pet peeves about the question?
Yeah.
Sure. So the question is phrased between law enforcement and the community. And those who ever hear me talk about law enforcement, if you are a person who took the oath and you swore to protect a community, guess what? You are part of that community. I think one of the things we have to start doing is saying law enforcement and community, or law enforcement with the community. Because the thing about what we're seeing now is that we have the community and we have law enforcement. Until we get away from that mindset, we're going to be back in this conversation over and over again. But the one thing that I think when it comes to race and ethnicity, and this sort of goes about the word trust. I love the word trust because I do believe, and I need you to keep me on time, Jason, but I do believe that the word trust could be misconceived sometimes because there's always going to be trust with law enforcement. The question is, what type of trust is there, right? And I go back to what Chad was saying is that is every interaction that you have with law enforcement builds on that trust. But if a person consistently have negative interaction with law enforcement, they're going to trust that police are bad. And if they have positive interaction, they're going to trust that police could be good. But I remember I told this story all the time about my bike, and you're talking about individual stories. You know, I had 2 interactions with law enforcement around my bike. One was when I got hit by a car, and the cop was there, and the cop didn't do anything, and it was like, oh, why were you in this neighborhood? And then the same exact bike, about 600 miles north, a cop stopped me and so on the same bike, and I was looking for a specific place, and the police officer said, hey, throw your bike in the back, I'll give you a ride. Same bike, 2 different interactions. So the trust is really what law enforcement tends to do when they have the opportunity to interact with someone.
Thank you, Terry.
So I'm going to follow up Dean Woodring, Community Relations Officer, and I'm glad I get to follow up Terry on this because some of the points that he brought up, you're going to see me address in my answer. And I apologize if it looks like I'm reading them. I am, and that's because 2 minutes is not a whole lot of time, and I just wasted about 15 seconds. So, as a police officer, I've experienced several incidents where an individual I've encountered had negative or more cautious attitude when speaking with me. It seems to be more prevalent with someone of a more diverse background, but not always. And when I can, I try to talk them through the situation and explain to them what's going on and why, because I think it's very important to explain to those with elevated emotion the steps that we're taking and the reasoning behind it. I try to talk to them through the situation, and I explain to them what's going on. And then I often take a chance to engage in a more personal conversation. And through doing that, I've come to find out that some of these individuals are wary of police because of how they've been treated by other departments. Kind of going back to Terry's 2 different encounters. And it seems that a lot of these come from departments in bigger cities. And I think that's just because with the amount of call volume and everything else, unfortunately, they're not dedicating as much time to getting to know those community members. It's just more of a law enforcement aspect or crime prevention aspect. But, between those interactions and what they see on the news, they sometimes unfairly group our department's officers with other departments, which really isn't fair. But I've also been involved in an instance where a person might be an undocumented immigrant, and in these cases, it's the hesitation to talk to law enforcement because of the fear of possibly being, deported. So to say that race and ethnicity don't play a role in how police and their community interact with each other is completely false. I don't think it's a simple answer, however, because with race and ethnicity comes culture, which can also play a large role in our interaction. But based on my experience, the ways we interact with individuals of different race isn't strictly based on race, but is more ingrained in their personal experiences as a result of their race, ethnicity, culture, etc. And each person has different experiences or perceptions of police, and it's our job to break those barriers and show that the idea of grouping people based on one factor is unfair and damaging.
Using this one. So for me, this hit home with a lot. Again, Iris Richardson, the first director for diversity, equity, and inclusion within law enforcement. I'm not even just going to say Penn State Police, law enforcement. At the age of 8, I grew up in a household identified as African-American woman who was told, or we had the talk, And it's not the talk that most people think that I'm talking about. I had the talk of how to interact with law enforcement at the age of 8. I had the talk of how to interact with law enforcement if I was to ever get pulled over by the police. I'm 8. I don't have a driver's license. I don't have a permit. I'm not even looking at a car at 8. But that's something that was ingrained in my household, information that was told to me in my household, and it took from 8 to the age of 17 when I had my first positive interaction with law enforcement at Penn State Berks campus that opened my eyes to so much. And so I say that because I have a lot of individuals in my community, but not just identify as African American, but just in general, who have had this talk at such a very young age, whether it's true, false, bias, perception, but then you have to go out into the world like we do with everything else and kind of break those barriers down. And so sitting in front of you today, growing up in Philadelphia, where I don't have 100% trust in the police that's there, but I have 100% trust in the police that I work with now because of the trust that I built, because of the relationships that I built, because of the uncomfortable conversations and the journeys that I took from 8 to 17, and I sit in front of you at the age that I am now, that I'm not going to disclose. But I just wanted to hint at how young some of these things are ingrained in us and we have to undo. So we sit here today to talk to you about how to undo that, and like we shared, this is a start. I didn't have this conversation until I was 17 on the positive side. Everything before that was, if you have the police, this is what happens. Never if you have the police, they want to play basketball with you. Never if you see the police, you're going to be out riding a bike and they might help you. I never had that experience, nor did I see the police engage that way with me in my community. But then when I came here and I went to Penn State, Berks, I got to see those interactions. So it kind of broke down some of those barriers. So for me, that was my experience.
I can go, yeah. I think one really salient element about this community is how transitive and a place in which there's a lot of turnover in terms of people, especially students. As a student myself, who's graduating in May, hopefully, I think students of color often bring their predisposed opinions about law enforcement to this community from wherever they come from and from their own personal experiences. I mean, even me as a queer person of color, you know, historically, police and queer people of color have not had a great relationship. And so knowing that history that brings and the reality of what might happen to, or have happened to people like me, it brings a lot of uncertainty when I think about these interactions. And I think this uncertainty is, I can't even imagine how other communities of color who have been more documented in terms of more negative relationships with police, how they feel. But I think something that a lot of students and I have really tried to hone in on is talking about racism as a system rather than an individual characteristic of a person. And so I think one of the important conversations that we have to have is thinking about, yes, like, and something that I've tried to wrestle with is, yes, there may be really good people on the police force, but even good people are susceptible to the forces of systemic racism and systemic homophobia. And so how do we move forward as a community trying to address the structural changes that need to be made so that the good people on the force or in positions of power don't fall as often to these structural components that were put in during a time that, quote unquote, there weren't as many good people out there. And so, yes, that's all I have.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think to answer this question, a bit of a primer is needed through an immigration lens. So immigration law and policy is by and large a federal matter. So Congress has delegated to federal agencies the authority and responsibility to enforce immigration law. So some of you have heard of the big mammoth agency called the Department of Homeland Security, and within that agency are enforcement functions. One enforcement arm is called ICE, or Immigration Customs Enforcement, and they function a lot like what you might consider as police. They conduct arrests and detention, they place people in trial, and maybe one unique feature is that they also execute removal. And so one looming question over many decades has been, what should the relationship look like between local police and localities generally and this federal agency? And those questions have been answered through a legal lens because there are, situations in which involvement by local police can raise legal concerns as well as liability if there is racial profiling, for example. But then there are a number of policy questions too. For example, how does it advance or undermine public safety if police try to cooperate or engage in immigration enforcement? How does it affect trust if someone who is undocumented is afraid that reporting a crime might place them in removal proceedings? And there's been this rising consciousness of the number of black and brown people in the criminal justice system, but it's important to know that this is also transferable to the federal immigration system. Many people who have committed crimes who also are an immigrant with or without status may also enter into the federal immigration system. And so that's one aspect or way in which the federal immigration system is racialized as well. So I've said a lot there, but I'll end by saying that much of this education has taken place through the relationship building that we've had with the state college police department and, to a lesser extent, university police, and by airing out and understanding legal parameters and policy concerns, we've been able to move the ball forward.
Awesome, thank you. For Patricia and also Lieutenant Chen Hamilton, I'm going to ask you to keep it brief, but I'll give you the first go-around for the next one so you can take a longer amount of time like everyone else just did, okay? So keep it brief for you two for this question. We'll move on to the next one. You get the first dibs.
I'm just going to, Patricia talked about it and we just heard it. Education and training in the police profession is vital. Dean mentioned an incident where somebody's fearful of being deported. That's something we would never address at our police department because we have been properly trained. We are aware you don't do that. And I have encountered personally victims of domestic violence that are fearful to come forward and have a conversation. It took a lot of rapport building and a relationship of trust to get the information to prosecute somebody that committed a pretty heinous crime against a loved one. Training, education, and just keep moving forward with our ability of knowledge.
I was just simply going to echo that, and I can pull that together because that has a lot with what I was going to say as well. In the task force, in addition to the lived experiences of a number of our members who shared with us, as we're sharing here tonight in those discussions, but we also reviewed research articles, and people brought written resources, and national organizations and government bureaus and so on that had published studies and put those all together. And bringing this down to a real quick summary, building on what Chad was just saying, is that part of the framework in the recommendations that I'll share with you after a while really had to do with enhancing education and training in cultural sensitivity and responsiveness, with the goal of providing additional insight, perspectives, and effective strategies, action, for those charged with the responsibility of responding to a diverse population, and finding ways to make that available in ways that can make it especially effective and useful to the people who are trying to be helpful in the roles that they have with others.
Thank you so very much. All right, 2 questions down. Number 3, y'all. Number 3, y'all. Let's keep things moving. The question is, and you two get the first dibs. I'll start with you, Patricia, to start this off. Describe the intersectionality of mental health, policing, and race. How does it impact community safety and well-being?
All right. Now to the action part of the task force as promised. Forming the recommendations was only the end of the beginning. The recommendations were accepted by the Borough Council and the Commissioners in November of 2020. And I need to say they were accepted with enthusiasm and commitment to the way going forward. It was an acceptance of the fact that this was not a task completed, this was a map provided for a way forward. An implementation plan was developed and significant work was begun on those recommendations. Speaking to the impact on community safety and well-being, the first recommendation was to create a countywide co-responder model or a fully civilian mental health response unit for crisis engagement. And the committee was, the task force was well aware, and using that word model, we were simply saying something that works to get this done. And whatever that would be what works in Center County and in State College as part of this as well. I'm here to tell you this evening that significant progress has been made on two fronts. The Borough created and staffed the position of the State College Police Department social worker with express purpose to promote community safety for those persons facing social challenges such as mental health illness, substance abuse, homelessness, and also to serve as a wellness resource for police officers and civilian staff in carrying out their duties as well. The responsibilities include program development, case management, community engagement, such as this, regarding social services in the State College Police Department service area. This is the part I think will be especially interesting to all of you this evening, and Chad may be talking more about this himself. The social worker will respond in real time with law enforcement as requested to cases involving aspects of mental health, using intervention and de-escalation techniques to prioritize safety. Assistance through case management, advocacy, and reference to supportive social services as follow-up to individuals will also be provided. I mean, this is a very big step forward in terms of forging those connections and partnerships and seeing our police officers as truly being there to help. Here's just a little nugget. In the first 5 months, the social worker was involved in 171 total referrals, 45% of which included partnering with crisis intervention responses in the first 5 months. The second initiative from this recommendation, equally important, and I think all of you will be very interested to hear this, is underway through the Center County Mental Health Office to significantly enhance mobile crisis response in Center County. This service is provided 24/7 by the Center for Community Resources. It includes intervention, assessment, screening, and referral services. Crisis services can be accessed by phone, text, or walk-in, but here's the important part on top of that. Crisis staff can travel to community sites, to schools, or to homes as requested and needed. In the past, we've had 3 mental health workers, 24/7. 3 mental health workers were available to respond to crisis calls across the entire county. Through a grant secured by the Center County Mental Health Office, the number of responders is going to triple as all the hiring takes place. Here's the other important part. They're being assigned geographically to areas to support all law enforcement departments, all 6 of those departments, and also school districts in Center County. The significant aspect of this, and why I'm so pleased to share this with you, is that this is going to significantly reduce response time and increase coverage and accessibility. And so these two initiatives are going to work together to put that co-responder model into the Center County and State College way of doing things. Thanks for the extra time.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good
Yay.
stuff there. Let's give some other voices to the mix. Who's next?
I'm going to follow up with Patricia, if that's okay. Just, I'm kind of the boots on the ground with the social worker program and the CIT and mental health. And everything Patricia has just said is up and running. We do have a social worker who has been a huge asset for the department. Prior to the social worker position, that was something a lot of times I did personally as a police lieutenant, and that is making referrals, getting very deep into mental health. I'm a police officer, but we want to make sure that people are being referred and they're getting the services they need. So a lot of times that was falling on sworn personnel to do. We now have a social worker to do that. The outreach she's doing is phenomenal. The county, so much progress in the past couple of years with mental health. They are fully staffed, my understanding. I just found out today that they are fully staffed, and they have mobile crisis 24/7 to service all the police departments. No, it's like everything else. There's still work to be done, but we're a lot further than we were a couple years back.
So we just heard about how the systems are in place now, the systems that are building on the progress that we made. Let's continue the conversation, some other perspectives if we can. Go ahead, Terry.
Another perspective or the same perspective?
What is your response to the question up on the screen?
Well, you know, first of all, I got to say kudos, though, because I think I had a chance to meet the mental health counselor with the State College Police Department, and the work that she's doing, I think is going to be so important in this community, and also is what the community asked for, and especially the task force. I think that was really good stuff. But when I read this question, I do have a little twist on it, because I go back to the systems that are in play, right? So we talked about racism. I'm going to throw in that space ableism as well, because when we look at an ableist society, typically mental health is not a topic that people want to talk about. Obviously, this community is starting to be a little bit different because we are talking about it and we're doing things about it. But you know, so I had a symposium last year on mental health and policing, and it was breaking the stigma for policing. And the reason why we chose that topic was because this little open a door in this conversation. Law enforcement need to start talking about mental health internally. Like, I think there was a buddy of mine who sent me a video of a police officer who was really burdened by racism and then committed suicide. And I think one of the conversations that we don't have often is, if we are having police be responsible for community safety, we have to make sure they too are safe mentally. And so I define actually community safety and well-being. I said community safety is when everyone takes responsibility for the safety of themselves and others. And community well-being are actions and steps that are taken to encourage and support and maintain wellness. And what I mean by that is, if we have a system in place that can provide space for law enforcement who are struggling with mental health to come forward and get the help they need, that directly impacts our community safety. So I would love to, again, my ideal world is I would love to see a space in which, again, mental health is not not stigmatized, where we can talk about it, but also where we can say, if, you know, hey, I'm Officer so-and-so, I'm really struggling right now. I need time and space to discuss this. That's where we need to be as a community.
Thank you, Terry. Shobha, go ahead.
Yeah, I just love what you said, Terry. And, you know, it's similar to the legal space when lawyers are working with and representing vulnerable or traumatized populations. And now, you know, the term that's used now is trauma-informed lawyering, right? In a similar way, we also need trauma-informed officers, in addition to addressing even secondary trauma that might take place, especially with boots on the ground. I was going to answer this question a little differently, I decided 10 seconds ago. And that is, you know, part of the interaction between police and immigrant communities, and this is also tied to training and trust and education, is to understand how mental health and well-being is connected to an immigrant who might be uncertain about their future. That could be somebody with DACA or deferred action for childhood arrivals who are living every 2 years and court decision by court decision, you know, without any clarity of what might happen next, or someone's vulnerability with a police officer in a uniform if they come for a country where a person who is in a uniform is someone they associate as someone who might harm them or torture them. Finally, back to the fear of reporting to police, so much of how police work in someone's home country, as well as fear of deportation, might tie into fear in a community. And so to eliminate or at least mitigate fear and improve well-being, that's where we need affirmative policies, trust, and cooperation.
Okay, any other thoughts on this?
I'll just say quickly, I think I also come from an interesting place as a part of an advocacy group, and I think, you know, the coalition has been at the spearhead of a lot of these policies and pushing for these policies in the community in the last couple of years, especially after the death of Osazi. And I think something that we've noticed is really how important advocacy and being involved in the policies that you want to see in your own community is in actually enacting change. And so I think the only thing that I want to sort of say about this topic is the importance of advocacy in also pushing these policies forward, and the importance and frankly the necessity for people in both, you know, in the role of like structural reform, or also in the roles of protesting and die-ins and other direct actions as well.
Thank you. Any last thoughts from, go ahead.
I'm going to be very brief. It's kind of hard to follow up with all those answers, but I think the biggest thing that I took from this conversation on this question, or the most important thing I've taken, is what Terry said. And we as the law enforcement community that serves this community cannot effectively serve you if we're not taking care of ourselves. And it is important to note that you may not see it, but these steps have been taken to address those issues. We have a peer-to-peer counseling program that has been set up. We recently just sent a few more officers to be trained to do the peer-to-peer because it is important that we take care of our own mental health. But the only thing I wanted to kind of bring up is we have these programs in place, and we're trying to launch them, but it's important to understand that we aren't mental health professionals, and these programs, as a police officer, I can assure you that I fully support, because it takes additional responsibility off of my plate so that I can focus on other things and allow the professionals that are fully trained in mental health to deal with said issues. Unfortunately, we're still on the beginning, flight of this, so we still run into issues of not having enough workers, and oftentimes police officers are still the first ones to respond to these mental health calls. But it's also important to understand that Center County, again, is very fortunate to be where we are, because our officers go through the crisis intervention team training, which is occurring this week for new officers that haven't had it. Lieutenant Hamilton has been there this week, and it's correct me if I'm wrong, it's a very lengthy 5-day long course where they cut out lunchtime and everything else, because it's an important aspect for law enforcement to deal with. Does that make us mental health professionals? Absolutely not. But all these things that we're talking about taking place not only better serve the community by allowing them to have access to the resources that these individuals need and the contact with the mental health professionals that they need, but it also allows us to focus on our mental health and takes some responsibility off us so that we can focus on us, and so that we can do the job that we need to do correctly for you. And one of the biggest steps that we took was the peer-to-peer counseling.
Thank you.
I just want to. I just wanted to add really quickly an initiative that University Police and Public Safety implemented as well around mental health, and it was broadening the resources for addressing different types of mental health. We sometimes categorize certain issues and put them in buckets and expect for people to respond the same way, and everybody doesn't do that. And so I challenged my team to go, you know each other better because you spend endless days and nights with each other. And so if you notice that Iris is not her bubbly self, or not showing up the way she does, or not groomed the way she is, those are signs that something is going on. It's not always leading to a mental health thing, but you want to address it. So having those uncomfortable conversations internally with your peers and your colleagues and your friends, and most of us family, because we spend a lot of time together, to then outwardly go out and be able to do that. And I think, again, we do weekly, monthly, like meditation, mindfulness, journaling, let's cook together. So just different things that tap into challenging, you know, the day in and out that our officers go out and see some of the most crucial things. As some officers always say, officers don't get called to a barbecue. They get called to a crisis, right? And so they got to go in with that face. And culturally, that's a cultural change that I'm excited that my position and 26 other colleagues of mine are trying to implement some of these things, because again, as officers, they're not seeing it. The culture for them is go do the job. But me, I'm going, Officer Dean, something's off. Let's have a conversation. So we're implementing some of those things as well.
One of the things I want to point out is that we have a lot of folks on stage who are deeply involved in taking action in the community. You're hearing a lot of action steps, some perspective, but there's a lot of stuff going on, so hopefully you're taking that in. Everybody, we're halfway through this. Can we give a round of applause for everybody so far? Now that y'all got the applause, I'm going to ask y'all to keep it at 2 minutes, okay? All right, so we can get through the rest of the questions. All right, Sue, go ahead.
All right. How do negative stereotypes affect the interaction between communities of color and law enforcement?
All right, I'm going to try and set precedence here with less than 2 minutes. I think when you look at that question, the most important thing to understand, and it goes for law enforcement and the community, every individual is unique. You cannot group individuals based on one similar factor. And when you talk about that, we're talking about when I go in the community, just because someone's of one race doesn't mean that they're all going to have the same experiences. When you talk to a police officer, you're going to have different attitudes from police officers. Hopefully, you know, the experience is good. Sometimes it might not be, depending on the situation. But understanding that we all have different experiences and understanding that we're unique individuals creates the ability to learn and understand each person that we come into contact with as a unique person that has something to offer, rather than just saying, this is the impression the person gave me, this is how I feel about everybody.
This question makes me think of what we train, a lot of the verbal de-escalation, a lot of CIT is just going back to human universals. Everybody, no matter who we talk to, what we're talking to them about, everybody wants to be heard, everybody wants to be treated with respect. They're human universals. And that's how we try to police, and sometimes that doesn't always go, whether it be the person we're talking with. They might not feel that way, but where we are, that's what we want to approach it, everybody.
That wasn't 2 minutes either.
I can go on. And I think something else is, I did forget this at the end, everybody wants to know why. You know, law enforcement, historically, we don't explain very well what we're doing. I come from a world, and I'm sure older law enforcement officers remember, ask, make, tell. That's how we were trained. Ask, make, tell. You ask somebody, you tell somebody, then you make them. We are very far away from that right now, and gratefully so. People want to know why, what we're doing, and that's what we have to slow down in the profession, establish that rapport, and explain why we're taking action, why we are there, why I'm showing up at your house at 2 o'clock in the morning. Your stereo's too loud. We don't, treat them with respect and explain why we're doing something.
I mean, this might be the most negative thing I say, and because I'm a very positive person, as you've heard me so far, is that, negative stereotypes are encrusted in our culture and in our mindset, and they impact decisions. They can lead to racial profiling. They might be part of our implicit biases or our explicit ones. So it took me no time at all to rattle down some, pervasive stereotypes about immigrants that exist in our culture, right? In the last administration, the president called all Mexicans rapists. Over many, many years, I've practiced immigration for over 20. Some of the stereotypes that I've heard or been present to are Latinos are undocumented. Immigrants are criminals. Muslims are terrorists. Asians are submissive and smart too. And so these are just some examples of stereotypes that are also part of some of the implicit biases we might all have. And that's what makes question number one so important. Trust, relationship building, and greater understanding.
So for me, yeah, I appreciate that response to you, but I actually totally agree with that as well. I always think of negative stereotypes like a really bad smell, you know. It's like that, you know it's there, you can identify it, you know, and I would appreciate what you said too, Chad, like you actually specifically pinpoint a cultural identity in law enforcement that you said this is what we've been taught. Sometimes I think one of the things we gotta start with is identifying just those things, right? And the second part of having a bad smell, once you identify it, you find out what it is and then remove it. You know, I think about the any time that someone in law enforcement works with us telling their narratives, right? It sort of humanizes who they are, right? It tells them, you know, they might go into dialogue about their family, you know, might go into dialogue about their community, their faith, whatever it may be. But the one thing that is also important is that there needs to be opportunity for law enforcement to have dialogue with their community. Just like today. I think this is why this is so important, is that we're able to have a specific dialogue and really look at, you know, what law enforcement is and how it does play out when we talk about race. But when we talk about negative stereotype, I think one of the key components is that we have to identify within law enforcement and in the community, what are those bad smells? And how can we identify it and remove it? I mean, because and that goes both ways. That also goes for the community that looks at law enforcement, right? What is it that, like Iris talked about her story when she was young, I had a similar conversation. As a matter of fact, the bike story that I told, I don't know if my mother's watching or not, but till today, I haven't told her about that bike incident because she would say, I told you not to go in that community, right? And I think the fact of the matter is that we have to identify what those stereotypes are and then try to remove them.
Thank you, Terry.
I'll also keep it brief. I think what Dr. Wadia and Terry both said about how, you know, negative stereotypes are encrusted in our subconscious and how they're almost like bad smells that we can't ignore, I think are two elements that are sort of the crux of what the only point I want to make is that I think ignoring the contributions of the contributions of negative stereotypes to our subconscious actions is one of the most detrimental ways that we can address this, that impede our progress in addressing this problem. And I think, you know, being able to realize that these are going to exist no matter how hard we try to eliminate them just because of how we've grown up and how our culture is. And I think that plays in hand with a point that I made earlier about how trying to address your own biases is not trying to address a character flaw, but necessarily it is a way of trying to address the way that you grew up in a system of racism. And I think that is something that I have learned in my own advocacy and my own work trying to combat racism, and I think that is something that would benefit everyone in the community, no matter your perspective.
Thank you, Anton.
This won't surprise any of you knowing I'm an educator, so I looked up the definition of stereotype. It's an overgeneralized belief about a particular category of people, which we've just heard all kinds of examples of that in many different ways, that it's pervasive and it's detrimental, and that we need to find a way to, and I'm not stating this as hyperbole, to eradicate it. It needs to be gone from our social systems in order to help us move forward and develop all people. Bringing this back to the task force, fully 20% of our recommendations had to do with education and training for those who are involved in, again, law enforcement, because that's what we're talking about. We believe that those are basic tools. They're not the only tools, but they are two important tools in helping to have people learn. these negative stereotypes and the examples that we've heard and that we've all experienced in our own lives may be formed and reinforced through misinformation, misperceptions, misunderstandings, negative experiences, and then generalized to the population. We know that those results are detrimental. I was going to mention about the crisis intervention training because that has been a major thing that was ongoing, I want to add, before the task force took place. The recommendation of the task force was to increase that and to proceed with it, which is happening. I did want to share this one thing with you because I think you'll be happy to hear this. In 2020, when we completed our report, 97% of Center County officers had received this CIT training, and it is an extensive 40-hour training, and there was reinforcement of that. This is one of the highest averages in Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Patricia. Any other thoughts before we continue, Iris?
Really quickly, I'm so used to just talking, I'm sorry. I share with you that I sit in front of you as an African American woman. You can stereotype whatever that means. I sit in front of you as an African American woman from Philadelphia. You can stereotype what that looks like. I sit in front of you as an African American woman in a position in law enforcement, in a civilian role, and you can stereotype what that looks like for you. So I'm an outcast to many. So stereotypes are detrimental to me. Stereotype, and I'm sharing my story because I can only speak the facts to me. I lost 5 friends when I told them I joined our law enforcement department because of their negative stereotypes. I'm not an officer, and I said this to Officer Dean, taking away nothing that he went through to be an officer, but I work alongside him, yet my stereotypes, or the stereotypes of law enforcement, are tacked on to those that are trying to make changes internally and externally. And that's where the negative stereotypes need to be discarded. From law enforcement side or whatever those negative stereotypes are, to the individuals that have identities of underrepresented groups. A movie that I will give you if you've never seen it, Black is Black and Blue, where a young lady who's African American goes back into her community as an officer and tried to give back to her community, and she's outcast by not only the police because she's not blue enough to be with them, and not for her community because she's not black enough to be with them. Yes, she shows up every day trying to protect and serve the community. Internal, her brothers and sisters in blue, and external, her community members that she served. That's what stereotypes, negative stereotypes, are doing to our community. So part of that change is creating positions like me and individuals like us who are willing to take the world on our back and try to do what we do, but we're looking for all of you to help support that. It is a team effort, it's a team approach, and so that's my personal connection to this negative stereotype that I live with every day.
Thank you, Iris. Of all the things that you take away today, hopefully the personal stories will be some of the ones that you think of throughout your week. While you're walking around, talking to folks, having conversations about race. If you can't remember all the bullet points of all the wonderful things we're doing, remember some of the stories. 5, the 5th question of the day. How does the history, this is a big one, okay? How does the history of our country and or inception, I know, it gets even better. How does the history of our country and our inception of policing play out in society today? It's a big question, y'all. Who wants to hop into it first?
So how fitting is that question? Because that's exactly what I do a lot of talking about, is specifically policing history as far as black police officers, right? So those who don't know, I will share the reason why I started SFJ was because I found out that my great-grandfather was the first black officer in the city of New York to have a full career, and my uncle was the first black police officer, sergeant, lieutenant, and parole commissioner for the NYPD to work for the NYPD. So when I talk about history, I've been asking this question on this perspective of black law enforcement as what has changed in the last 110 years. And some of the stories that Moses P. Carp and Samuel J. Battle shared with us does show that there is some issues that need to be addressed within law enforcement. And I think it was maybe 2 years ago when we celebrated the 110th commemoration of Samuel Battle. We asked officers to share their stories about, whatever it may be. And some of the stories that was being shared with us was very similar to the stories that Samuel Battle has went through, being the first. And we got Iris here who was a first. And we talk about the first, which is always can be problematic. But I think one thing we have to acknowledge, and there's two things in particular, and I want to stick to Center County too. One is that, yes, law enforcement did start with the slave patrol. That is the first thing we have to be acknowledged, is that there are still elements of law enforcement and the slave patrol that still exist today. It may not be in Center County, but like I said, we have a community that is a revolving door. So people are coming from other communities in which they're bringing that with them.
You said slave patrol.
Slave patrol,
Okay.
right. And so there's a whole museum on it. If you want to go to Atlanta or DC, talks about that whole piece. But when you have, and again, I'm speaking from the perspective that's been told to me, when you have law enforcement of color enter this field, there is a burden that they're bringing with them in that conversation. So one thing that we have to consider, and when we look at the history of policing in this country, is that policing was created not for everyone, both as a civilian and as in policing. The question that we have to ask ourselves today is, how can we change that culture? There's been so many times where I'd say, like Iris, hey, I work with policing, and I get like, ooh, ew, why would you want to do that? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. I have them share their narratives, and I call them the good police. There's no such thing, right? And so the question that we have to come up with is the history of policing does have some racial undertones. We talked about a couple months ago about the animals in policing, right? Horses and dogs, and the racial undertone that has, right? We have to address those things because they still exist. So, and even though Iris and we are privy to some of the inside knowledge of law enforcement as in why those things exist, it still has the racial undertone that has to be addressed.
Thank you, Terry. How does history of our country and the inception of policing play out in society today?
I guess I'll follow up. So, Terry talked a lot about, the history and some of those issues that still exist in policing today. But I also think it's important that we understand that history is probably the best way to learn from the past. And looking at law enforcement from the 1700s, law enforcement, you can't deny law enforcement has grown substantially in the right direction. And that's continuing right here today by having these conversations that weren't had, 2-3 years ago. But history is a way to look back at what worked, what didn't work, and how can we improve. We're in an age where community policing has become a pinnacle role of majority of today's police departments, where not long ago, as I mentioned before, it used to be law enforcement and crime prevention. And I think it's also important to understand that learning from that history, we've also learned that members of the community can be a very vital part of law enforcement by addressing and having the conversations with them about what their concerns are so that we can increase the quality of living in those communities, so that we can address the fears that they might have in their community and the major concerns that they have. So for me, to look strictly on it's important to look at the negatives of the past and see what's still there, but I think it's also very important to not only look at what happened in the past, but what's happening now. Because if you only focus on the past, you're setting yourself up for failure, and it's just creating a setback for us to move forward.
I can kind of wrap up the law enforcement realm, and again, I'm going to go back to training.
history has a way of creating more training, creating better training. Unfortunately, when something goes wrong, law enforcement debriefs and we come up with a training. But unfortunately, a lot of those moments, something bad has happened. But that's how we learn. It's the old adage, you learn from mistakes, and the profession as a whole over history has learned from, like anybody else, learned from mistakes. So that's all I have.
Thank you.
Following from what you teed up for this, and again, what I have to share with you has to do with where do we go from here and what kinds of things can happen. Once we head off some of the difficulties from happening, then there's also what happens after. And so one aspect pertaining to mental health, our society has come to rely more and more, as we've discussed, on the police to respond to and provide that initial contact. I was quite surprised to learn, even with the reading and preparation I did with our task force, that in 2020, nearly half of those in our Center County Correctional Facility, Center County, were either diagnosed with a mental illness, were on medication, and or in treatment. Both law enforcement professionals and mental health professionals agree that that is not the most effective path to justice, rehabilitation, or treatment in our society. We can do better. We must do better because we have learned from the past. So there are two things that have happened. And again, they have happened. They are moving along now. Two recommendations of the task force resulted in two major initiatives. In Center County, District Attorney Contorna convened a multidisciplinary group of law enforcement, judicial, and community service providers to create a behavioral health jail diversionary program. And that began operating in 2021. It provides a required treatment-based option through a selective application and review process for those charged with a crime and have a diagnosed behavioral health problem. In the first 7 months, 24 applications were received and 63% of those were approved. And at this point, you can go online, Center County website, and look at 2021's report, the full report, and the 2022 report will be coming up in the next few weeks. So you will be able to see how this particular impact is having a positive effect for people in our community. In addition, this work is continuing through Center County Court System on the creation of a behavioral health court that will handle potential criminal cases where a behavioral health condition is involved. There are more than 20 of these courts operating in other Pennsylvania counties, and it's slated to begin this spring in 2023 with Judge Oliver presiding. So these two initiatives are dealing with the aftermath of involvement with the criminal justice system in one way or another, but we can still work on both ends of the process.
Thank you.
I think one thing that we've mentioned here is how we can learn from our history and to see how we can use our history to improve what we have now. But I think another thing that our history can be used is for the people in power, they learn about their mistakes. And so they adapt their methods of oppression and discrimination to the new era. And I think we've seen that with, disinformation in today's age with social media as a potent weapon of mimicking a lot of historical trends of fanning alternative sentiments. And so I think when we talk about our history, we also talk about a history that has often worked against groups that are trying to enact change. And so I think when we talk about, how do we make change, I think we also have to acknowledge that the often said mantra that progress isn't always linear, and sometimes progress looks like we go 10 years back. And I think that we often look at our history in an optimistic light, but I think it's smart of us to say, how is our history being used and weaponized as well? And I think as someone who has tried to make change and advocated for certain changes and met with a lot of resistance. That has been my perspective in terms of, how our history has shaped, change making in this community and in the country. So.
Thank you very much.
I mean, I don't know if this answers your question directly, but I do think history is an important tool for education, which has been said. And I think it can also be why we have negative stereotypes in current society. So looking at immigration history, there is a very long history of exclusion and enforcement based on race. There were explicitly racial laws all the way up until 1965. It was only on the heels of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that Congress ended what were called national origin quotas in our immigration system. Asian immigration was completely shut down until 1965. And so now we have a largely facial neutral immigration law, but it remains crucial to see how those laws are being enforced and whether these facially neutral laws are enforced in discriminatory ways, and how those disparate impacts may trickle down to our own community.
Thank you. Any last? Iris, did you go for this question? You're good? Okay. You good? Okay, ditto. I like that. I do want to, history touched everything from the legal system all the way down to us individually. Just want to point that out when it was addressed. Number 6, we have 2 more questions left, everybody. We got about 30 minutes left. We are on time. Thank you, y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you, y'all. Let's go. Let's go. I appreciate you. So keeping us on time. Sue, next question, please.
How does national news concerning minorities and policing affect, if at all, our local area?
Don't all jump at the question at once.
How does national news
Microphone.
How does national news concerning minorities and policing affect, if at all, I'm gonna just take that out.
That's fine.
Policing affect our local community. I shared this with you before. We bring individuals, we recruit, we live, we gather from all over the world. For 6 months to 2 weeks, people come pass through Center County. And again, this is where I share, I'm responsible for 22 campuses, and I know we're talking about Center County, but there could be an incident in the next town over that impacts my local community, vice versa. And so the news outlets, the platforms have turned news platforms into negative interactions, engagements, you name it. We don't see the positive. We don't see the good. And so, yes, it impacts all of us in that way. But we have people that come from the other side of the world to down the street that join us here in Center County. Center County in itself has its own culture. I tell students that are international, you're coming here to the U.S., that's a culture shock. You're coming to Pennsylvania, that's a culture shock. And then you come into this little town called Center County, AKA Happy Valley, that's a culture shock. And so when you take all of those pieces and you recognize what those individuals are bringing or not bringing to the table, that's where we get some of the issues that we see globally that's happening. So all of us have access to a TV or radio to hear about what's happening. I think this question speaks to itself without an answer outside of that.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm giving an immigration lesson here. But, this is a very multidimensional question and also goes in both directions. Sometimes local news can be national. But going back to one of my very first points, that immigration is by and large a federal responsibility, because most of immigration law and policy comes at the federal level, and is sometimes in the media, it will have an impact on our local community because every community is impacted by federal immigration law and policy. I'll give you a couple of examples. The detention facilities in the state of Pennsylvania that contract with ICE to hold immigrants are both national and local. They affect our community. A second example might be the first executive order of exclusion issued by the former president, sometimes known as the Muslim ban. We were the fourth most affected university in the country by the first Muslim ban. When I had my first community forum through my clinic in 2017, we had standing room only with over 250 people in 2 overflow classrooms. And those are just 2 examples of how national changing policy at the national level has a direct implication on our community.
Thank you for that.
All right, so I'm going to answer this question in 2 different aspects. First, for those not familiar, I am also part of the police department's recruiting team. And I can tell you right now, and I'm sure Iris can kind of back me on this because I've seen her at multiple recruitment trips, but the national news affects our ability to meet our ultimate goal of better serving the community, because one of the goals that most departments look to achieve is to have a law enforcement force that reflects the community as far as the makeup, racially, ethnically, whatever. And it's very hard to recruit minorities with today's national news, and we've gone as far as going as far east and west, south, north of this state as you can possibly think of. And it's not only affecting those numbers, it's affecting the numbers in general. We're talking when I first took a police exam, there were 300 plus applicants for just State College. When I took it in Allegheny County, there was 3,000 plus applicants. We are lucky to hit 100 anymore. So the national news doesn't only affect our ability to fill those positions that we have, but being unable to fill those positions with people that better reflect the community that we serve. But rather than just leave this question on a negative note, I think it's also important to understand that because of the national news with with minority involvement, a lot of people in the community have started asking questions, good questions. What kind of training do you have? What kind of policies do you have? Questions that were never asked before until something bad happened. And the good thing that came out of it is we started having conversations like this. We started making task force. People started realizing we had policies in place to address those concerns before these concerns were ever brought up. Bias-based policing was something that our department had targeted and addressed before we even saw it. But people didn't know that until we started asking, until they started asking the questions. So there is a positive aspect to that, and it's that those that aren't in law enforcement are starting to ask questions to understand law enforcement. Those of you sitting here right now are getting the answers that you never thought, or to questions that you never thought you'd have to ask. But here we are.
I yield my time to Dean.
We're making up our time.
No, I like it. I appreciate it. I'm just gonna sit down over here now.
Okay.
Who's next?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think national news, and I sort of incorporate social media into that as well, as a Gen Zer myself, I think has been, like everyone on this panel has said, has brought its negative effects to this community. And I think that brings into questions about media literacy and, where do we get our news? But I think at the same time, I think national news and social media has been able to put a spotlight on some of the realities that marginalized communities face, but people of all different kinds that you wouldn't normally meet in State College are brought to our attention through national news, through social media. And so I think, being able to realize that the reality in another place may be the reality of some people in Happy Valley, I think is an important aspect that may be overshadowed by a lot of the noise and loads of information that is present out there. So, yeah, just a concern about media literacy and over-information.
Thank you very much.
This is just a simple thing, but again, that you triggered a thought that in doing work like in a task force or reporting of the misfortunes that happen in other communities that reach the national news also provided a source of information for us. What happened there, what mistakes were made there, what lessons can we learn from what happened there that we can bring here and examine and take a look at. So for all the well-expressed inherent dangers and difficulties with some of that, access to a national agenda also gives us access to well beyond our own areas of expertise to try to solve problems in our own way.
So I have a different twist to this question. Can you hear me? There we go.
No, you're good.
All right. So I have a different twist to this question, just because whenever I work with a police department, I always pray there's no national issue that's about to hit, because I've been let down before. I'm not going to mention, it's not locally either, but there was a police department that asked me to come do some work, and then like 2 weeks after that, a national news story broke out, and I was just like defeated. I was just like, come on, man, really? You know? And so when I look at this question, I also look at how national news impacts a community's well-being. Like, I know that folks on this stage who spend tireless hours advocating, strategizing, collaborating, moving forward, and then if something happens nationally and we all are deflated, we're just like, God. You know, and that's one of the things that I always struggle with is whenever there's a national story, whatever it may be. Give you an example. George Floyd happened, right? We all witnessed that, except for me, because I refuse to watch the video. I still have not watched the video. I refuse to watch the video. And when George Floyd happened, my cell phone blew up. And mostly it was police officers across the country saying, Terry, please don't stop doing what you're doing. This is not policing. And it was just like it's like you're trying to do this work and something like this happens, and you start to question yourself. Is it worth it? Am I spending my time correctly? Am I doing the right thing? Do I need to change my strategy? And it becomes so tiring. And I don't know how to express it, but just being exhausted every time I see a national title. Because to me, I feel for the families, I feel for those who are harmed, I feel for those communities, but I also know in my own local community, we are going to have some troubled souls because of it. So how does it impact local? And one thing I would add too is I would love for law enforcement to be able to, I hate the word capitalize, but at least have the skill set when these things happen to be able to address the community from their perspective. To be like, you know what? This happened. And like my cell phone, I wish I could share those text messages because that's what the community needs to see, right? I mean, that's what they need to see. They need to see police officers saying, yeah, that was some BS. You know what? We would never hire that person here. And I think that's what I want to see come from national media. And I said this at a training presentation before. I said one goal I want to see law enforcement do is have the competencies to look at a national story, no matter how horrific it is, to say, this is what policing is, and this is what we won't tolerate in our community, and use those stories as a jumping platform. So I hope to answer that question.
You certainly answered that question, yes. Any last thoughts? I'll give you an extra...
I want to respond to what Terry said,
Let's
if
go,
you want,
yes.
if there's 30 seconds left. No, you know, it's a great solution, or one of the tools in the toolbox, and it's really tied to messaging, right? And it also requires a level of insight and intelligence on what are the national news stories that are going to impact our community psychologically, actually, indirectly, and then how do we send a message to the community about a national event and say, we know this impacts members of our community, so they feel heard and seen. And that's crucial.
Thank you all. Everybody, we're up to our last question formally. If we do have some time, it's up to how long y'all speak for the rest of this question. Sue, would you like to ask the last question of the evening?
Absolutely. What is your vision for a safe and inclusive community from your own perspective? And if you have them, what are the next steps towards achieving that vision? Boy, that's a big question to answer in a couple minutes.
I can go first. So I did my homework wrong and switched the moods of the first and seventh question. So this is more of my specific actions answer. But I'd like to reiterate like what I said in my first response. I am a police abolitionist, and yet I am also a person who wants to make change. And so I realized that change, steps in the right direction for change is change. And so to reiterate some of the questions that community members, borough council members, other government officials had regarding the protest last year, they asked how come protesters didn't know their rights and how come they didn't know why the police acted the way they did during that situation. And so to address the specific answer to that question is I think it would be useful if the police policies for those specific actions could be public. And I think having gone through the police handbook myself, the policies regarding use of force, regarding crisis intervention are all redacted. And so I think being able to be transparent about those policies, and if unable to be transparent about those redacted policies, a summary of why they're redacted for the community would be helpful. And then now you guys would be able to answer the question of why didn't the protesters know? And now it's in their ballpark. And I think two more things. The transparency about the crisis intervention training would be really helpful and really useful in boosting the amount of transparency that the police have while serving this community, as well as how the crisis intervention training could be potentially improved. And then lastly, I want to sort of piggyback off of what Patricia has talked about in terms of the mental health task force, but increasing the capacity for more mental health training and mental health, addressing mental health, and at that intersection of mental health and policing, and what that looks like in terms of budget transparency, and things like that. So that's my last statement.
Thank you, Anton. All right, Terry, it's up to you. Go ahead, man.
No. That's a great question, actually. My vision is to have a safe and inclusive community. That's my actual vision itself. But when I think about that question, I think there's some things that we have to sort of acknowledge. So, looking at the folks on the stage, the folks that showed up today, I think the most important piece is to understand that we did show up today, right? We are here. I usually have a rule, not a rule, I usually have 4 steps in each time I'm doing this work. The first step is to organize. And I think one of the things that you heard today was a lot of organization, right? A lot of advocacy works. And I think advocacy is also one piece of it, but I think the 320 Coalition also put out things they want to see happen, right? So advocacy is usually one part of it, but the other part is to list out what you want to see happen. I think the other part is we have to strategize, right? And one piece that we typically do not do, especially when we have an incident that is a hot topic, is strategy goes out the window and people just sort of react. So I think strategize is one That's the next one. Third is mobilize. We have to mobilize. We have to actually be able to, take it where it needs to go, right? I think the fact of the matter is when we have any situation, we have to be able to actually take action and make sure that we are talking to the right people, we are asking for the right things, we're asking the right questions, et cetera, et cetera. And then the fourth thing is just to materialize, make it happen. I think one concept that this panel today is showing is that, between the mental health task force, between 320, the law clinic, et cetera, is that we all have things that we're doing to actually contribute to safety and well-being. And so we are starting to see these things materialize, but I do want to acknowledge that folks who are doing this work, it is tiring. It is, I put a quote on my talk about social media, right? I put a quote on my social media today. I said, recognize fighters for who they are. People who have accepted strained hearts, sick minds, and weary spirits for their people. I think that's exactly what we're doing.
Wait, Terry, say that one more time for us. A little bit.
Sure.
Slower. Yeah.
I can't say it. I say it slowly in my theatrical voice. Recognize fighters for who they are. People who have accepted strained hearts, sick minds, and weary spirits for their people.
Thank you, Terry.
It's hard to follow that. I don't have a quote. So locally, I really do think, and it's not because, and I do want to give a shout out to Jesse Barlow, Tom Fontaine, Chief Gardner, Ezra Naines. The Borough State College is a model. Looking at my Facebook, I never thought I was going to use social media today. Yesterday, a memory popped up, and it was from 6 years ago, and it was the immigration enforcement resolution that the Borough State College passed. And that's a great example of a resolution that really was a written set of principles and values to guide policy throughout the borough and also the police department. And led to the inclusion of an immigration policy in writing within the police department's anti-bias-based policing policy, training for police officers on the same, affirmative protocol for steps officers can take to actually help immigrant survivors of crime and trafficking. So much headway that I'd love to see replicated in other municipalities and police departments. And in the broader community generally, inclusive policy in my wish list would include some kind of municipal ID or a way for everyone in the community to have identification. And in my greatest wish list, for everyone to have the ability to drive. Because for me, it's a public safety issue. It's part of community safety and security. People are going to work. People are putting food on their tables. Many states do allow for driver's licenses, regardless of status or more broadly. And that's a policy I'd love to see. Now, on a federal level, since I've been talking about federal, in order for there to really be change, we have to see changes at the federal level. And that's both legislatively and as a matter of policy. This administration has issued policy on ensuring that immigration enforcement at the federal level does not lead to discriminatory outcomes. And I think that's a great value that we can think about at both levels, but because so much of immigration enforcement and policing happens at the federal level, we really have to look at both.
Awesome, thank you.
I think I do have a quote. To be true to my mission here, I do want to ground this question in my experience with the task force. And so borrowing the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who said, life's most persistent and urgent question is simply, what are you doing for others? So our vision, the work of our task force, our vision for a safe and inclusive community from that perspective is embodied in the recommendations, and most importantly, going back to what Terry was saying, the actions. It's not just making the recommendations, but the actions that are involved. And those are the next steps being taken in pursuit of them. That will help many individuals and their families, as well as direct service providers in our community. Our vision for a safe and inclusive community is one in which community engagement follows those effective practices of participatory problem solving, decision making, and opportunity creation that we experienced in our committee over those 18-month period. We were a very diverse group of 32 people. We worked together with a shared vision and clear intention. We communicated freely, openly, and respectfully. We listened to understand another's viewpoint and experiences. We thoroughly reviewed, reflected on, and challenged our assumptions and current practices. We had the courage to tackle painful issues and questions. We used lived experiences and validated those. We used sound methodologies and evidence-based research to inform our thinking and decisions. And most of all, and finally, we kept our eyes firmly fixed on the desired outcome. To paraphrase again Dr. King, what in the end were we doing for others in our community? These task force recommendations are a start. Some are more easily implemented, others are more complex, require study for adaptation to Center County, resource sharing and acquisition, and challenging data management for future assessment and adaptation of their effectiveness. Some aspects have been implemented, most are and will of necessity continue to be works in progress as continuous improvement is built into the system. And I do want to end on a note similar to what Shobha was saying, that we want to compliment and appreciate the energy and enthusiasm with which those leaders responsible within the borough and within the police department and within the Center County and their respective colleagues have undertaken the considerable effort involved in both embracing the spirit of the task force recommendations and operationalizing initial programs and practices. It's encouraging and bodes well, and I truly wanted to end on that positive note. Not easy, but it bodes well.
Thank you. The question is, what is your vision for safe? I was waiting until you were about to say something just to repeat the question. What is your vision for a safe and inclusive community from your own perspective? And what are the next steps towards achieving that?
Humanity and patience. It took a very long time for the world that we live in to get to the space that it's in, whether we agree or disagree with it. It's going to take patience, hard work, and humanity to get us to the next step. The 6 of us sit on this stage. You hear the passion in our voice. You've seen probably us in the community doing amazing work, but it's not just us. It takes all of you in the audience, those that are on the video, listening, to contribute to the change that we want to see. But for me personally, I want to be seen. I want to be seen as the African-American woman that sits in front of you and what I contribute to this world. I want to be seen as the 5'5" individual or 5'4" individual vertically challenged that sits in front of you that contributes to the greatness that we are trying to do. So I say that to say all of the identities that you all have in this audience today, show up and show out and support each other and uplift each other, but also hold each other accountable. And that accountability does not look pretty. Another word that we're using is transparency. We assume transparency looks beautiful, but to be transparent, it ain't beautiful. And we got to take that and we got to digest that and we got to process what that looks like. So for me, safety, I want to feel comfortable again going outside my door and being okay knowing that I'm going to come back home. And I want that for my neighbors that surround me in this community as well, with the identities that they wear and the things that they have. Because I can't change being 5'5", black, and everything else that goes along who I am. And so I want you to accept me as much as I accept you, is the vision that I see.
All right, so I purposely went towards the end because I feel like I kept jumping in front of everybody. Mine's more of a blanket statement, but it kind of goes, my answer to this question kind of goes back to our first question, and that's trust. What is a vision or what is my vision for a safe and inclusive community? One where we can trust each other. Going back to what Iris said a few questions ago, she should be able to have those that she knew before getting into the law enforcement realm to trust her decision, and to trust that she's doing it for the right reasons, instead of questioning why she did it and possibly being looked at as a traitor. We need to be in a community where we can talk to each other about things that we don't understand and that make us very uncomfortable without being hesitant doing so. We need to be able to build new perspectives and learn about others' perspectives so that we can come to appreciate them. We need trust, but you can't build trust without understanding, and you can't understand without communicating. And today, we're doing that right now. We're communicating.
I think the one thing we all agree on is just that, a safe community. And I can't top what everybody has said before me, but I think with our continued involvement, our collaboration, we can reach those goals, and I think we're definitely on our way. That's all I really have.
Can we get a warm round of applause for all of our panelists? One of the difficult parts of moderating is that we're not supposed to, share our opinions. And so many times I was like, oh, I want to hop into this conversation. But of course, these experts here that are working so hard in our community were the voices that we needed to hear. And hopefully you received some of the information that was shared with you today.
Nice. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what's down the road. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Audience, thank you so much to the panelists. We want to thank everyone for trusting us with your time, your experiences, and your emotions. There have been many things said here tonight, and we understand we haven't gotten to questions because we have used all of our time. So I want to let you know that there is a breakout session that will take place this Thursday. That's January 12th. And that is in the municipal building, room 201. And that's from 6 to 8 p.m. So that's a breakout session to follow up on some of the
Say that again? 5 to 7. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. 5 to 7, room 201. That's this Thursday. That's January 12th. And that's just to follow up on the conversations that have taken place tonight. So please join us if you can. And then stay tuned for future topics in this series of conversations. And if you want to add any additional questions to the jar that was in the lobby when you came in, please feel free to do that on your way out.
And I don't have a necessary approach to how we're going to address all the questions that are there, but know that they are going to be reviewed and they're going to be shared with the folks that are here, and hopefully we can form a response to at least some of those questions that are presented here this evening. We want to give a special thanks to the folks who are behind the microphones and the lights. Can we give a round of applause for everybody in the back for State Theater? Can we give we would like to thank the State College Borough and manager Tom Fontaine, Natalie, I'm gonna call you Natalie V so I don't mess up your last name, Community Engagement Specialist, and Kyla, Communication Specialist at the Community State College Police Department, Chief John Gardner, for being open and adamant about having this conversation series. And last but not least, we would like to thank the Community Conferencing of Center County's Outreach Coordinator, Tiara Williams, and Facilitator Coordinator, Elizabeth Siegelman. For more information about the borough's progress, please visit statecollegepa.us. Thank you again, everybody. Have a good night, and please continue the conversation. Have a good night.